June 9, 1944. Allied intelligence finds 9 dead Germans in a Norman barn. 8 skulls crushed, no bullets, no explosives. Just physics, gravity, and a Kansas farmer who knew exactly how fast 60 pounds falls from 20 feet. The forensic team from the 82nd Airborne's intelligence section stood in the morning light, filtering through the barn's broken slats, staring at what shouldn't exist. Captain Robert Hendricks had seen plenty of death since landing in Normandy 72 hours earlier, but this was different. This was surgical. This was impossible. 8 bodies lay scattered across the hay-strewn floor in a pattern that made no tactical sense. Each had suffered catastrophic cranial trauma, the kind of damage you'd see from a falling beam or a direct artillery hit, except there was no structural damage to the barn itself. No blast patterns, no shrapnel. The 9th body, positioned near the door, had a single bullet wound through the chest. Standard issue. Nothing mysterious about that one. But the other 8? Hendricks crouched beside the nearest corpse. The man's Stahlhelm had been driven into his skull with such force that the metal had folded like paper. The angle was perfectly vertical, straight down, like God himself had reached out and pressed the delete button on this particular German soldier's existence. Hendricks looked up. 20 feet above, barely visible in the loft's darkness, was a wooden chute, a hay chute, standard Norman farm architecture, identical to thousands across the French countryside. Nothing remarkable about it except for one detail that made his blood run cold. The opening had been deliberately widened. Someone had carved away the edges with precise, patient effort. Someone who understood exactly what they were building. This wasn't combat. This was engineering. Vernon Hayes had been awake for 36 hours when he killed his first man with gravity. Not his first man in general. That distinction belonged to a Wehrmacht private outside Sainte-Mère-Église, who'd never seen the paratrooper behind him. But his first man using nothing but Newtonian physics, and 34 years of Kansas farm knowledge. He was born in 1910 in Hutchinson, Kansas, in the heart of wheat country, where the land stretched flat and golden to every horizon. His father, Samuel Hayes, owned 240 acres of winter wheat and a barn with a loft that could store 3,000 bales of hay. That barn was Vernon's first classroom, though neither he nor his father would have called it that. At age 7, Vernon learned that a 60-pound hay bale dropped from the loft to the ground floor took exactly 1.1 seconds to fall. He learned this not through equations but through consequence, dropping a bale onto his father's foot and watching the man limp for a week. Samuel Hayes didn't believe in coddling. He believed in lessons that left marks. At age 12, Vernon learned that angle mattered. A bale dropped straight down might land on the feed pile harmlessly. A bale dropped with even a slight lateral push could travel 6 feet horizontally before impact. This lesson came when he accidentally buried the family dog under half a ton of Timothy grass. The dog survived. Vernon never forgot the geometry. At age 16, he learned that consistency was everything. His father had him drop bales through a specific chute every evening for 2 years, training his muscles to remember the exact motion, the precise release point. 2,000 repetitions, 2,000 drops, each one calibrating his nervous system to understand weight, momentum, and gravity in ways that no physics textbook could teach. By age 20, Vernon Hayes could drop a 60-pound bale through a 2-foot opening from 20 feet away in total darkness and hit a target the size of a dinner plate. He did this not because it was useful, it wasn't particularly, but because Samuel Hayes believed that mastery of one skill taught you mastery of all skills. If you could make gravity obey you, you could make anything obey you. Vernon married Mary Ellen Tucker in 1935. She was a school teacher from Wichita who thought farming was romantic until she experienced her first wheat harvest and realized it was actually systematic torture conducted under a merciless sun. They had no children. The land was enough family, Vernon would say, which was his way of avoiding the conversation about Mary Ellen's 3 miscarriages and the quiet grief that had settled into their bedroom like permanent fog. December 7, 1941, changed the mathematics of Vernon Hayes' life. He was 31 years old, married, and engaged in essential agricultural production. The draft board wouldn't touch him. He was more valuable growing wheat than carrying a rifle, except Vernon Hayes didn't see it that way. He saw the newsreels from Pearl Harbor, and made a calculation that had nothing to do with farming and everything to do with geometry. Either you fight where the fight is, or the fight eventually comes to you. He volunteered in January 1942. The recruitment officer looked at his birth certificate, looked at Vernon's weathered face and said, "You're too old for infantry, son." Vernon Hayes stared at him with the flat, patient expression that Kansas farmers develop after years of arguing with weather patterns and commodity prices. "I can carry a 100-pound sack of feed in each hand for a quarter-mile without stopping. I can work 16-hour days in 100-degree heat. I don't get tired, I don't complain, and I don't quit. Now you tell me which fresh-faced 18-year-old from Brooklyn can say the same thing." The officer signed the papers. Basic training at Fort Benning was designed to break men down and rebuild them as soldiers. It didn't break Vernon Hayes because Vernon Hayes had been broken and rebuilt by harder things than drill sergeants. Heat exhaustion? He'd harvested wheat in Kansas summers. Sleep deprivation? He'd worked calving season. Physical punishment? Try bucking bales from sunrise to sunset for a father who considered rest a moral failing. What did surprise the Army was that this 32-year-old farmer could shoot. Not just competently, expertly. Marksman qualification on the first try. The range instructor asked him where he'd learned. "Coyotes," Vernon said. "They eat lambs. You learn to shoot straight or you learn to tolerate screaming." The 82nd Airborne was recruiting, and Vernon Hayes volunteered again because he'd already committed to the principle that if you were going to do something, you did it completely. Why jump out of a perfectly functional aircraft? For the same reason you planted an entire field, even when wheat prices were garbage. Because the work needed doing and complaining about difficulty was just wasted breath. He made his first jump at age 33. Landed hard, rolled wrong, sprained his ankle. Got up and did it again the next day because that's what Samuel Hayes had taught him. Pain is just information, and information is only useful if you act on it. By June 1944, Vernon Hayes was a 34-year-old private in the 82nd Airborne, which made him roughly 1,000 years old by infantry standards. The kids in his unit, and they were kids, 18 and 19 years old with peach fuzz and hometown girlfriends, called him Pops. He didn't mind. He'd been called worse by livestock. His best friend in the unit was Eugene Morrison, a 20-year-old from Ohio who talked too much and wrote letters to his mother every single day without fail. Morrison had attached himself to Hayes with the instinctive recognition that young things have for the presence of something solid and permanent. He followed Hayes around like a baby duck, asking questions about farming in Kansas and whether wheat really grew as tall as a man. "Depends on the rain," Hayes would answer, which was his answer to most questions about farming because it was usually true. They jumped into Normandy together on June 6, 1944, at Aura 130 hours, part of the massive airborne operation designed to secure the western flank of the invasion beaches. Hayes landed in a hedgerow, got tangled in his chute, cut himself free, and spent the next 6 hours locating his unit in the chaos of scattered drops and German patrols. By dawn, he'd linked up with Morrison and 12 other men from their company. The next 48 hours were a blur of minor skirmishes and repositioning as the Allies fought to expand their tenuous foothold in France. Hayes killed 3 men in that time. He didn't think about it. There wasn't time to think about it. You saw the enemy. You fired, you moved. Farming had taught him to break complex tasks into simple sequences. Combat was just another harvest. On the evening of June 8th, Hayes and Morrison drew patrol duty. They were supposed to scout a cluster of farm buildings 2 kilometers west of their position and report on German movement patterns. Intelligence suspected the Germans were using the area as a checkpoint for supply columns moving toward the coast. They moved in darkness, avoiding roads, using hedgerows for cover. Morrison was nervous. He was always nervous, and kept adjusting his rifle strap every 30 seconds, which made a distinctive leather-on-metal sound that set Hayes's teeth on edge. "You're going to get us shot," Hayes whispered. "Sorry, Pops, can't help it, feels wrong." "Then leave it alone and let it feel wrong. Wrong is better than dead." They reached the farm buildings at 400 hours. 3 structures, a main house, a storage shed, and a large Norman barn with the characteristic steep roof and stone foundation. Hayes signaled Morrison to watch the barn while he checked the house. Standard patrol protocol. Cover each other, move methodically, don't get impatient. Hayes was 15 feet from the house's rear door when he heard the voices. German. Multiple speakers. Close. He froze, hand signaling Morrison to get down. Morrison didn't see the signal. He was looking the wrong direction, distracted by something in the barn, and he was standing fully upright in the open yard, silhouetted against the lightening eastern sky like a cardboard target at a shooting range. Hayes watched in the kind of stretched crystalline time that the brain creates during catastrophe, as 9 German soldiers emerged from the barn, saw Morrison, and opened fire simultaneously. Morrison's body performed a brief, spasmodic dance, as 9 rifles emptied into him from 30 feet away, and then he fell in a loose, boneless heap that Hayes recognized instantly as the shape of death, because he'd seen that exact collapse 100 times in livestock. The Germans laughed. One of them walked over and kicked Morrison's body to confirm the kill. Another made a joke that Hayes couldn't understand, but could interpret perfectly from the tone. Something crude, something dismissive, something that reduced Eugene Morrison from a 20-year-old kid who wrote letters to his mother into a piece of garbage to be cleared from the yard. Hayes's hand tightened on his rifle. His finger found the trigger. The range was easy. He could drop 4, maybe 5 before the rest scattered. But then what? He was alone, outnumbered, with no support and no backup. Firing would give away his position and accomplish nothing except adding his own corpse to Morrison's. So Vernon Hayes did what Vernon Hayes had always done when faced with impossible situations. He calculated, he waited, and he planned. The Germans dragged Morrison's body into the barn. Hayes watched their pattern. 9 men, regular patrol. They used the barn as a staging point, arriving at dusk and departing at dawn. A checkpoint exactly as intelligence had suspected. They'd be back tonight. Hayes retreated, reported Morrison's death to his commanding officer, and volunteered for solo recon duty that evening. The officer, a 23-year-old lieutenant who'd been in France for 3 days, approved it without much thought. One less soldier to worry about. Hayes returned to the farm at 1500 hours, approaching from the south through a wheat field that reminded him painfully of home. The Germans wouldn't arrive until dusk. That gave him 4 hours. He entered the barn carefully, checking for sentries or booby traps. Empty. The building was maybe 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a loft running the length of the structure at 20 feet above the ground floor. Hay storage, animal pens, feed chutes. It was identical in every meaningful way to the barn Vernon Hayes had worked in for 34 years. He climbed the ladder to the loft and found what he was looking for immediately: a hay chute. A simple wooden tunnel, 2 feet square, running from the loft down to the ground floor at a 45-degree angle. Its purpose was to drop hay bales from storage to the feeding area without carrying them down the ladder. Basic farm engineering. The kind of thing you found in every barn from Kansas to Normandy. Hayes knelt beside the chute and ran his hand along the worn wood. The opening at the loft level was small, maybe 18 inches across, designed to guide falling bales rather than let them tumble freely. But the concept was sound. The physics were perfect. He took out his trench knife and began carving. The wood was old oak, hard and resistant, but Hayes had patience that came from years of fence mending and equipment repair. He widened the opening slowly, methodically, creating a hole roughly 3 feet in diameter, large enough to drop something bigger than a hay bale, large enough to aim. Below, the chute opened directly above the barn's main floor, right where the Germans had been standing that morning, where they'd laughed over Morrison's body. The drop was 20 feet vertical. Hayes did the math instinctively. An object falling 20 feet accelerates to roughly 25 miles per hour at impact. Mass times velocity equals force. 60 pounds at 25 miles per hour equals approximately 1,500 pounds of force, concentrated into whatever surface area hit first. 1,500 pounds of force would crush a human skull like an eggshell. Hayes climbed down and spent the next hour collecting materials. He needed weight, heavy, dense, compact. The barn had scattered debris from shelling, broken stones, shattered brick, chunks of concrete. He gathered the largest pieces and carried them to the loft. Then he found abandoned sandbags in the storage shed, the kind engineers used for fortifications, and filled them with the rubble. Each sandbag, when full, weighed approximately 60 pounds, the same weight as a hay bale, the same weight his muscles had been trained to handle for 34 years. He positioned 8 sandbags beside the widened chute opening, 8 for the 8 men who'd killed Morrison. The 9th, the one who'd kicked the body, would get something different, something more personal. By 2000 hours, Hayes was in position. He lay prone in the loft, invisible in the darkness, with the 8 sandbags lined up like artillery shells beside him. Below, the barn floor was empty, quiet, waiting. The chute opening yawned in front of him like a gun sight aimed at hell. At 20:45 hours, he heard voices, German, multiple speakers, coming closer. Hayes' heart rate didn't increase. His breathing didn't change. This was just another task that needed completing, another field that needed planting. You didn't get emotional about planting. You just did the work. The barn door opened. 9 shapes entered, silhouetted against the fading twilight. They moved casually, talking, laughing, completely unaware that they'd walked into a kill box designed by a Kansas farmer who understood gravity better than they understood their own mortality. Hayes watched through the chute opening as they spread out across the floor below. His angle was perfect. He could see directly down, watching them move like insects in a jar. They were positioned in a loose cluster, maybe 15 feet across, well within his drop radius. The first target was easy. A tall German corporal standing almost directly under the chute, lighting a cigarette. Hayes lifted the first sandbag, held it over the opening, and calculated. The man was stationary. No lateral movement. Pure vertical drop. The simplest geometry. Hayes released. The sandbag fell silently, tumbling slightly, and covered 20 feet in 1.1 seconds, exactly the time Vernon Hayes had known it would take since he was 7 years old, and had dropped a hay bale on his father's foot. The impact sounded like a rifle butt striking a watermelon. The German's head snapped straight down into his shoulders with such force that his knees buckled, and he collapsed sideways in a boneless heap. The cigarette fell from his lips, still lit, rolling across the floor. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The other 8 Germans stared at their fallen comrade in complete confusion. He'd just fallen. No gunshot. No explosion. Just a sudden, catastrophic collapse. "Was ist das?" one of them said. "What is that?" They clustered around the body, bending over, trying to understand. This was the tactical mistake that Vernon Hayes had been counting on, the instinctive human response to investigate the inexplicable. Hayes dropped the second sandbag. This one caught a German sergeant in the act of kneeling, struck him at the junction of neck and shoulder, and drove his face directly into the stone floor with terminal velocity. The crunch was audible even from 20 feet up. The man's helmet rolled away, empty. Now they were panicking. The remaining 7 Germans jumped back from the bodies, raising their rifles, spinning in circles, searching for the threat. But their training betrayed them. They looked horizontally, toward the walls, the doors, the windows, places where snipers hide, places where ambushes come from. They never looked up. Vernon Hayes dropped the 3rd sandbag, then the 4th in quick succession. Both struck targets. One German took the impact directly on top of his Stahlhelm and went down like a demolished building. The other caught the edge of a falling sandbag on his shoulder, stumbled sideways, and took the 5th sandbag directly in the face. 5 down, 4 remaining. And now the survivors were screaming, firing randomly into the darkness, bullets spanging off stone walls and wooden beams. One of them shouted, "Scharfschütze! Scharfschütze! Sniper! Sniper!" But there was no sniper. There was just gravity, physics, and a farmer who'd spent 3 decades learning to make objects fall exactly where he wanted them to fall. The remaining 4 Germans broke for the door. This was expected. Hayes had positioned his last 3 sandbags specifically for this moment. As they ran across the floor below, bunched together in their panic, he dropped the 6th, 7th, and 8th sandbags in a rapid sequence that would have impressed any artillery spotter. 6 struck a running German between the shoulder blades and drove him face first into the ground with such force that his rifle skittered 15 feet away. 7 caught another man in mid-stride and sent him sprawling in a loose tumble that ended with his head bent at an angle that heads don't bend. 8 missed, the first miss of the engagement, and slammed into the floor with a sound like a hammer striking stone. 2 Germans remained. One had made it to the door and was scrambling through, already gone, vanished into the darkness. The other had frozen near the barn's rear wall, pressing himself flat against the stone, rifle raised, searching desperately for the shooter who had just decimated his entire patrol in under 3 minutes without firing a single shot. This was the one. This was the man who'd kicked Morrison's body. Hayes had memorized his face, his height, his movements, had watched him through the entire engagement. saving him for last. Hayes picked up his M1 rifle, aimed carefully through the chute opening, and fired once. The German jerked backward as the bullet punched through his sternum, hung on his feet for a moment in that strange, suspended pause that the dying sometimes experience, and then collapsed. 9 men had entered the barn. 8 lay dead on the floor, their skulls crushed by sandbags dropped with the precision of a farmer who'd spent a lifetime learning exactly how gravity worked. 1 lay dead by the wall, killed by the only bullet fired in the entire engagement. Total elapsed time, 4 minutes. Vernon Hayes sat back from the chute opening and vomited. Not from fear. Fear was something he'd process later, if ever. But from the simple physical revulsion of having just killed 8 men using a method that felt less like combat and more like exterminating rats in a granary. There was something profoundly wrong about it. Something that violated the basic contract of warfare, where both sides at least pretended to be fighting. He'd just murdered 9 men who never had a chance to fight back, never even saw their killer, never understood what was killing them. He wiped his mouth, collected his 8 empty sandbags, climbed down from the loft and checked each body, all dead. He took no equipment, no papers, no trophies. This wasn't about souvenirs. This was about making Eugene Morrison's death mean something other than a joke that Germans laughed about while kicking corpses. Hayes left the barn at 21:15 hours and melted back into the Norman hedgerows. Behind him, 1 German, the one who'd run, would be reporting back to his superiors about an American sniper with a weapon unlike anything they'd encountered. A silent killer, a ghost who struck from nowhere and killed with perfect precision. They'd be looking for a sniper for the rest of the war. They'd never think to look up at a hay chute. Captain Hendricks stood in the barn at 0900 hours on June 9th, staring at the hay chute opening, and finally understood. His forensic team had dismissed it initially, just a structural feature, nothing important. But Hendricks had grown up on a farm in Nebraska. He knew what hay chutes were for. He knew how they worked. He climbed the ladder to the loft and found the widened opening, the carved edges, the patient craftsmanship, found 8 empty sandbags stacked neatly in the corner, found a single boot print in the loft dust, size 11, American issue. Son of a bitch, Hendricks whispered. He climbed down and gathered his team. Pack everything up, this investigation is closed. Sir? His sergeant looked confused. We haven't determined. I said closed, Sergeant. Put in the report that it was an artillery strike. Direct hit, case solved. But sir, there's no blast damage. Then put something else, I don't care. But nobody outside this barn learns what actually happened here. Is that understood? The sergeant stared at him, processing the implications. Sir, if we could replicate this technique, that's exactly why we're burying it. Because if we spread this around, we'll have every idiot private in the army trying to drop sandbags on Germans from barn lofts, and 99% of them will just get themselves killed. This worked because whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. It's not reproducible. It's not teachable. It's a one-time miracle, and we're leaving it that way. Hendricks filed his report that afternoon. Artillery strike, 9 enemy KIA. No unusual circumstances. The paperwork went into a file box, the file box went into a larger crate, and the crate eventually made its way to a warehouse in Maryland, where it would sit undisturbed for 59 years. The German report was more interesting. The survivor, a young private named Klaus Hoffmann, described the attack to his commanding officer with the kind of wide-eyed intensity that suggested either profound trauma or complete psychosis. They fell from the sky, Hoffmann said. Like God was throwing stones. We couldn't see him, we couldn't hear him. They just fell. 8 men, dead in minutes. I ran. I'm sorry. I ran. His commander sent the report up the chain with a note. Possible new American sniper technology. Silenced weapon with extreme range. Recommend immediate investigation. Some German intelligence spent 3 weeks trying to determine what kind of weapon could kill 8 men with no sound, no muzzle flash, and perfect accuracy in complete darkness. They never considered gravity. Why would they? Gravity doesn't discriminate. Gravity can't be aimed. Gravity is just gravity. By July, the incident had evolved into legend. Der Geisterscheune, the ghost barn, where an American phantom had slaughtered a German patrol using a weapon that left no evidence and no explanation. German units began avoiding the area, giving the barn a wide berth, like sailors avoiding cursed waters. The French resistance heard the stories and embellished them, adding details about American super soldiers with experimental technology. The British heard the French versions and assumed it was exaggerated propaganda. The Americans never heard anything at all, because Captain Hendricks had made sure the truth stayed buried. Only Vernon Hayes knew what had actually happened, and Vernon Hayes wasn't talking. He returned to his unit on June 9th and reported to Lieutenant Murphy, who asked him about Morrison. "Dead, sir. Got caught in an ambush at the farm buildings west of here. German patrol. 9 men. They executed him. Did you engage?" "Yes, sir. I eliminated the patrol that killed Private Morrison." Murphy looked at him carefully. "You eliminated 9 Germans, solo?" "Yes, sir." "With what? Did you call in artillery?" "No, sir. I used available materials." Murphy waited for more details. Vernon Hayes offered none. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, and Murphy finally said, "Well, good work, Private, dismissed." Hayes saluted and left. That was the only conversation he ever had about the incident with a superior officer. Among the enlisted men, rumors spread. Pops had gone after Morrison's killers and taken them all out. Some said he'd used a knife. Some said he'd booby-trapped the barn. Some said he'd picked them off one by one in the darkness like Daniel Boone hunting deer. Vernon Hayes didn't correct any of the stories. He just went back to being Pops, the ancient 34-year-old farmer who moved through the war with the same patient, methodical approach he'd once used for planting wheat. He fought through France, Belgium, and into Germany. He jumped into Holland during Operation Market Garden and spent 3 days trapped behind German lines living on rainwater and raw turnips. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel in the shoulder, once by a ricocheting bullet that creased his scalp and left a permanent scar. Neither wound slowed him down more than a few days. In April 1945, his unit helped liberate a small concentration camp outside Munich. This was the only time anyone saw Vernon Hayes lose his composure. He walked through the barracks, looked at the survivors with their hollow eyes and skeletal bodies, walked back outside, and vomited behind a building for 10 minutes straight. When he came back, his face had gone completely blank, the kind of blank that suggested some internal circuit breaker had tripped to prevent permanent damage. He didn't speak for 3 days. When he finally did, it was to request permission to dig graves for the dead prisoners they'd found. He spent 72 hours digging graves in the spring mud, working with the same mechanical efficiency he'd once used for fence post holes, and when someone tried to relieve him, he said, "No, this is my job." Nobody argued with him. The war in Europe ended in May. Vernon Hayes returned to Kansas in September 1945, stepping off a train in Hutchinson to find Mary Ellen waiting on the platform with gray in her hair and tears in her eyes. She asked him if he was okay. He said yes. It was the only lie he ever told her. They went back to the farm. The wheat was tall and golden, ready for harvest. Vernon spent the next 40 years growing wheat, maintaining equipment, and living a life that looked identical to the life he'd lived before the war. He never spoke about Normandy, never joined the VFW, never attended a single reunion or ceremony. When other veterans asked him about his service, he'd say, "I was in the 82nd, and then change the subject. He died in 1987 at age 77, outliving Mary Ellen by 3 years. The obituary in the Hutchinson News said he was a farmer and a veteran. It didn't mention the 9 Germans he'd killed in a Norman barn using nothing but gravity and a lifetime of knowledge about how things fall. The full story didn't emerge until 2003, when a researcher at the National Archives found Captain Hendricks's original report, buried in a file marked Unusual Tactical Incidents, Classified. Hendricks had written a second classified report that told the truth, perhaps understanding that someday, someone should know that a Kansas farmer had turned his barn into a weapon and executed 9 men using physics that Isaac Newton would have appreciated. The French town that owned the barn, now in its 3rd generation of the same family, was contacted by a military historian who explained what had happened there in June 1944. They were skeptical at first, but when the historian showed them the widened hay chute opening that still existed in the loft, they understood. In 2004, they installed a small plaque outside the barn. It reads, in French and English, Le Trou de Hayes. In June 1944, an American soldier of the 82nd Airborne Division used this barn to avenge a fallen comrade. 8 German soldiers died here, killed by gravity and the knowledge of a Kansas farmer who understood how things fall. Remember Eugene Morrison. Remember Vernon Hayes. Remember that sometimes the simplest weapons are the deadliest. The barn still stands. Tourists occasionally visit, climb the ladder to the loft, look through the hay chute opening that Vernon Hayes widened on June 8, 1944, and try to imagine the courage, or the cold fury, it would take to crouch in darkness waiting for 9 men to walk underneath you so you could kill them with sandbags. Most can't imagine it. But then, most people haven't spent 34 years learning exactly how gravity works and what happens when 60 pounds falls 20 feet onto something fragile. Vernon Hayes didn't need to imagine it. He'd been practicing his entire life. The story raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of warfare and the line between combat and execution. What Hayes did wasn't honorable in the traditional sense. There was no fair fight, no chance for the enemy to surrender, no opportunity for mercy. It was cold-blooded, premeditated killing that used asymmetric knowledge to create a completely one-sided engagement. But it was also war, and Morrison was dead. And Hayes had made a calculation that 9 Germans who laughed while kicking a corpse deserved exactly what they got. A death that came from nowhere, understood nothing, and offered no opportunity to fight back. The Germans spent years trying to understand what had killed their patrol in the ghost barn. They developed elaborate theories about American superweapons and experimental technology. Soviet intelligence later acquired these reports and used them as evidence that the Americans were developing weapons systems beyond Soviet capabilities, which contributed to the arms race paranoia of the Cold War. All of it was nonsense. All of it traced back to a single farmer who understood that gravity accelerates all objects at 32 feet per second squared, and if you drop something heavy enough from high enough, it doesn't matter what's underneath. It's going to break. The tactical implications were minimal. Hendricks was right to bury the story. It wasn't a reproducible technique. It required a specific building configuration, a predictable enemy pattern, and a practitioner with decades of unconscious training in calculating falling objects. Trying to teach it to regular infantry would be like trying to teach them to perform brain surgery after watching one demonstration. But the strategic implications were profound. Vernon Hayes had proven that sometimes the most advanced training, the most sophisticated equipment, and the most elaborate doctrine could be defeated by someone who simply understood one fundamental thing better than anyone else. The Germans had better tanks, better machine guns, better tactics, but they didn't have a soldier who'd spent 34 years dropping hay bales through wooden chutes, and that single deficit cost them 9 lives in a Norman barn. This is the secret that great powers forget and small powers remember. Technology only matters if you understand the fundamentals. You can build the most advanced weapon system in the world, but if someone understands gravity better than you understand your rifle, you're going to die confused. Vernon Hayes understood gravity. He'd spent a lifetime in conversation with it, learning its rhythms, mastering its mathematics, developing an intuition for falling objects that existed below conscious thought. When the moment came, he didn't need to calculate. He didn't need to aim carefully. He just lifted sandbags and let them fall. And gravity did what gravity always does, pulled everything toward the center of the earth at exactly 32 feet per second squared. 8 Germans died because they forgot to look up. They died because their doctrine trained them to look horizontally. They died because their experience taught them that death comes from bullets and bombs, not from farm equipment used according to its original design specifications. They died, fundamentally, because Vernon Hayes knew something they didn't, and knowledge is always the most lethal weapon. The last word belongs to the barn itself. It still stands in Normandy, surrounded by fields that look remarkably similar to the wheat fields of Kansas. The hay chute still functions. The wooden structure, now reinforced and preserved, could still drop 60-pound bales from the loft to the floor below. Tourists who visit sometimes ask the barn's owner if they can drop something through the chute, just to see how it works. The owner always says no. Some things should remain theoretical. Some physics experiments should never be repeated. But on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the loft and makes the old wood creak, you can almost hear them. 9 sets of footsteps entering the darkness below, the sound of German voices laughing at a joke that's 78 years old, and then the silence that follows when gravity remembers exactly what it's capable of when properly applied by someone who knows what the hell they're doing. Vernon Hayes is buried in Hutchinson, Kansas, next to Mary Ellen under a simple granite headstone that says, Vernon Hayes, 1910-1987, farmer and soldier. That's all. No mention of the 82nd Airborne, no reference to Normandy, no indication that he once turned a hay chute into a vertical firing solution and killed 8 men in 4 minutes, using nothing but mass, acceleration, and a lifetime of knowledge about how things fall when you let them go. Maybe that's appropriate. Vernon Hayes never wanted recognition. He wanted Morrison avenged, and he got that. The rest was just farming. Identify the problem, gather your materials, execute the solution, and move on to the next task. No drama, no glory, just work that needed doing. And if that work involved dropping 60 pounds of rubble-filled sandbags onto the heads of 9 Germans who'd made the tactical error of laughing at death in a barn where a Kansas farmer was listening from above, well, gravity doesn't judge. Gravity just falls. And sometimes when it falls with precision and purpose and 34 years of practice behind it, gravity doesn't just kill. It teaches a lesson that military academies are still trying to understand. The most dangerous soldier isn't the one with the most advanced training or the most expensive equipment. It's the one who understands one simple thing so completely that he can turn it into a weapon when everything else fails. Vernon Hayes understood gravity. And for 9 German soldiers in a Norman barn in June 1944, that understanding was the last thing they never saw coming. If you enjoyed this story of how a Kansas farmer turned physics into a weapon, hit that subscribe button and join us for more untold war stories. Drop a like if Vernon Hayes earned your respect, and leave a comment below. What everyday skill do you think would be most deadly in combat? See you in the next one.